Ngalakin Khadijan Nyunga Boja.
All right, it should be up.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks to everyone for coming along today. My name's Troy Reynolds from the University of Western Australia. Before we do anything, I'd like to acknowledge the Nyunga people, the traditional custodians of the never ceded land in which we're meeting today, pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also extend that respect to all traditional owners, traditional custodians of all the lands which you're joining us from today. Something's going on with this mouse. There we go. We'll get all the problems out of the way now, and there'll be no more after this.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. So this project is supervised by coordinating supervisor Celeste Rodriguez-Luro, Maya Ponsonnet, Marie-Eve Ritz at UWA, Debbie Lotus, who's joining us today from Victoria, and with some technical advice from Adele Gregory, and a special thanks to Glenys Collard as a project advisor and supporter of this research. So my long-term work is a PhD thesis by publication. So today I'll be focusing on the first study, which centres on intonation. The idea is to present 4 or 5 papers for the thesis, prepared collaboratively with the research team and made up by my supervisors and collaborators to be able to carry out the type of empirically grounded research that I'll be telling you about today. A corpus of data is needed. So I'll also tell you about how these data were collected and about some of the interesting processes involved in working in the area of Aboriginal linguistics. I'll then summarise some of the early findings we have at the moment and offer some reflections on what's coming next. Some of what I'm presenting today is based on a presentation I delivered at the New Ways of Analysing Variation a few months ago in February, and I should acknowledge that some of the feedback given then has been brought into what we're presenting today. So today we'll be taking from the first study of the overall project, looking at the high-rising terminal as an intonational feature of AAE prosody. I'll be using the term AAE from time to time to refer to Aboriginal English or Australian Aboriginal English, if you're not familiar with the term. So the high-rising terminal, also known as uptalk, is a feature of spoken language in which there's a distinct rise at the end of an utterance within a specifically declarative syntactic frame. We're defining HRT here as a rise of at least 40% in the fundamental frequency between the first tonic syllable of the utterance to the final syllable of the utterance. So the tonic syllable being a syllable that, broadly speaking, has a relative prominence, and we're looking for the last one of these within the utterance and comparing the fundamental frequency, the F0, which is a frequency correlation with what we hear as pitch, and looking at a rise of at least 40% by the end of the utterance. So we want 40% up from the last sort of prominent syllable. I could go into a lot more, and I've probably completely mangled that definition, but nevertheless, this is our working definition. So early research on HRT described a predominantly female-led usage. However, more recent findings indicate that usage is spread more evenly between males and females. HRT has also been observed in varieties all over the world, as diverse as German, Californian, American English, think the Valley Girl sort of stereotype, Spanish, Japanese, and Arabic. So some of the features of uptalk, despite its superficial similarity to questioning intonations, uptalk is actually realised differently in terms of both form and in communicative intent. So here is an example of uptalk. I think it's quite a good example, spoken by an Anglo-Australian adult in an interview.
It's really important that we look forward to what we have ahead of us.
It's quite a distinct rise in pitch towards the end, although it is a statement. It's not in any means a question. So uptalk has been analysed in Australia for a few decades now, and one of the earliest studies being Barbara Horvath in 1985, who looked at varieties of Australian English and the social factors that surround their use. So this study recognised that uptalk is a marker of ethnicity in Australia, with newly arrived Greek women using uptalk significantly more than Anglo-Australians and other migrants. More recently, Anna Jaspersen's her studies of Sydney Aboriginal English identify more. Someone said my volume has just become lower. How am I sounding?
It's come back, I think.
Okay, great.
It's the Wi-Fi.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
The Wi-Fi's unreliable.
Okay.
But it's not on Wi-Fi.
Oh, that's true. Anyway, Anna Jaspersen has been looking at Sydney Aboriginal English and has identified more variability in the form taken. For example, the contours and excursions being the actual rise itself in Aboriginal English when contrasted with mainstream Australian English. And next door, in our neighbours in New Zealand, Britton and Newman found that Māori New Zealanders employ uptalk 45% more frequently than non-Māori New Zealanders. So there's still a great deal that is not known about Australian Aboriginal English prosody, and understanding how prosody is used in naturalistic interaction is crucial, as it can have a direct impact on how a message is interpreted. Miscommunication resulting from comprehension errors in a lot of cross-cultural situations has been demonstrated to have a significant social impact across a range of settings. So in Australia, just as in many other parts of the world, rigid and asymmetric structures of discourse in the classroom, the courtroom, etc., including the pragmatic functions of prosody, routinely are resulting in coercion and misunderstanding of defendants, victims and witnesses. Children raised in an Aboriginal English L1 environment are often faced with enormous challenges in the classroom, and cross-cultural misunderstanding being a hindrance to people's education. So what is Aboriginal English, if you're not familiar with it? Australian Aboriginal English, or AAE, is a term for a group of varieties of English spoken by Aboriginal people throughout the country, or, to put it beautifully as Madeline did yesterday, it's a constellation of features. I thought that was a really good explanation of it. So there's approximately 800,000 Aboriginal Australians, which is about 3.3% of the total population of the country, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Australians make up just under 4% of the total population here in Western Australia, with about 100,000 people. Aboriginal English shares influences from Australian Aboriginal languages, Creoles, as well as British English, and is a group of varieties distinct from mainstream or standard Australian English in a number of ways. It's suggested that Aboriginal English is used by many, if not most, Aboriginal people in Australia in one variety or another, and that for a large number of Aboriginal children, it's often the sole L1. So to adopt a comparative angle, and in the context of this preliminary study, we're comparing AAE uptalk to uptalk as used by working class Australian English speakers. Working class Australian English, which at times has been known as broad Australian English or vernacular Australian English, it describes English varieties spoken by working class people throughout Australia, and in our case, we're focusing on both Aboriginal English and working class Australian English in the Perth and Southwest Western Australian region. The choice to use working class Australian English in this way is influenced by the informal observation made in the literature that among the varieties of English spoken in Australia, working class Australian English is likely the most similar to Australian Aboriginal English, with the primary differentiation being prosodic. Both varieties are also historically marked and considered to have lower prestige than standardised linguistic varieties such as mainstream or middle class or general Australian English. So the present study is a work in progress and is the first segment of a three-part PhD thesis, which examines the ways in which prosody is used differently by Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal speakers of English, and which prosodic features, for example, age, gender, and ethnicity, may be related to some of these features. For this study, we're focusing on uptalk as an example of an intonational feature of Aboriginal English, which may play an important role in the communicative intent of an utterance, and how age, gender, and ethnicity may correlate with aspects of this use. Some implications. Understanding how Aboriginal English speakers use prosodic cues is important. So we generally look at linguistic variables that set AAE apart from other varieties and tend to focus on phonology, grammar, or even things like lexicon. But until now, we hadn't really engaged with the suprasegmental features that set Aboriginal English apart from other Englishes in Australia. And this is important because uptalk is highly interactional and is used in conjunction with functions such as asking and answering, which have been discussed widely in the applied linguistics literature. For example, Diana Eads in 2014 argues that miscomprehension of communicative intent resulting from intercultural variation on levels such as prosody can have profound effects on the outcomes of legal cases for some Aboriginal people. The data used were taken from two corpora. So the Aboriginal English data were collected by Celeste Rodriguez-Luro and Glenys Collard throughout 2019 in the context of Celeste's fellowship. And Celeste and Glenys used the method known as yarning to secure these data, which I'll be telling you a little bit more about in a moment. And the working class Australian English data were recorded by Dr. Sophie Richard over 3 years, with 1 or 2 participants at a time with open-ended cues and topics where needed. I was fortunate enough to participate in Sophie's project by doing a little field work, and I was also a research assistant on Celeste's project, so I was already quite familiar with the data, which is a nice thing to have. And the two corpora are similar and comparable in that they include mostly storytelling. It's a narrative-focused approach. So there's quite a bit of comparison that can be made there. So yarning. The Aboriginal English data were collected using this method, innovative method of natural language collection, tailor-made and developed for Aboriginal English fieldwork, which employs yarning. Yarning is an important culturally ingrained method of storytelling, decision-making, sharing of knowledge and cooperation in Aboriginal Australia, which has been used deep into Australia's history. It involves free-flowing interaction between people with an exchange of ideas and information and is an important feature in the social and communicative pulse for Aboriginal people around the country. I have a quote by Glenys here describing some of the early days of her collaboration with Celeste. So before going out into our community, Celeste had to firstly meet my parents. Celeste showed up with a written interview. I flicked through the questions and said, we don't need that. We yarned about it and I convinced Celeste that we could get this information without a questionnaire. It would be shame to use a questionnaire on my people. So it's about looking at ways of adapting the ideas we have about data collection specifically for the situation at hand. And we actually have a quote from Glenys again here, which she'll explain it in her own words.
Still one of the most effective ways of coming together to talk and hear and resolve issues that are concerning people at the time. But the thing about yarning is they can't have a time frame put on it. You cannot put a time on yarning. Yarning works in the old way, passing on knowledge. So you have to sit and hear long stories maybe, and maybe not so long, but you have to hear that before you can think you can go to the next place. Whereas in Western society, you just tick the boxes off. So yarning has to be kept at its original concept of yarning, to keep it true, and that help our people be able to participate in their own lives of telling their issues or what they believe is happening around them on a day-to-day basis, as yarning is something that never stops. You aren't an Aboriginal one day of the year, not 8 days. You cannot. We are Aboriginal people for all of our life, from the day we were born to the day we die. Young is the same concept. It's going to be there forever.
So the SWBD DAMSL is a system that we're using where we're encoding utterances with specific markers, recognising their role, their communicative role. So this is to deepen understanding of the communicative purpose of uptalk. So the utterances that we've extracted are coded with this system. SWBD DAMSL stands for Switchboard Dialogue Act Markup in Several Layers. So it's an annotation tool allowing us to label each utterance with one or more communicative function and then map the dialogue acts of each declarative utterance alongside their prosodic features. Individual labels are grouped into broader categories such as backward communicative functions agreement, which includes things like acceptance, rejection, and holding the floor. One example here of one of these categories is the answer category, which covers several response types that can be expected to follow an interlocutor's question and breaks answers down into various subtypes based on the acceptance or rejection of the previous questioning turn or the expansion of an answer with new information. And this is an example in the corpus which uses the uptalk rise here.
She was from Yearly Station.
So a straightforward declarative statement with this rise at the end. Onto the method itself. So at present, 852 declarative utterances are extracted from the first 10 minutes of dialogue from each of the 12 participant interviews, totaling 2 hours altogether. Each participant has a unique combination of 3 predictors. There are 6 women and 6 men, 6 Aboriginal and 6 non-Aboriginal participants, and 3 tiers of age groups being born approximately 1960, approximately 1980, and approximately 2000. I hope my sound is okay. Firstly, the final intonation phrase of each utterance is identified impressionistically, and the fundamental frequency of the tonic syllable measured against the fundamental frequency of the final syllable of the utterance using an F0 algorithm. This table shows, oh, sorry, just go back, getting ahead of myself. This table shows the number of declarative utterances extracted for each of the 12 speakers in the sample. So without going into too much detail, these are some of the systems we've been using. This is the Pratt system, which allows us to mark off various parts within an utterance and combine any number of levels of layers, phonemes, syllables, etc. This is the first program used to identify everything and then extract it. Then we have the voice source program, which allows us to extract, I think, 48 different algorithms of all kinds of things from energy to fundamental frequency to formants, various things like that, which becomes important later. Then the WebMouse program, which is just a website actually, which is a fantastic piece of software where all you need to do is put in a piece of audio and a transcription and specify which language this is, and it will pull it apart and find every phoneme for you and mark it off in the format that is then used in Pratt, so you can add it to a Pratt project. And then all of this information can be put inside the EMU package within the R program. So you can have multiple levels and all of this information is put together. You have a nice searchable, queryable program. One of the interesting parts in the journey of the last year and a half with this work are the ethical considerations and some of the questions surrounding authority and ownership and community support when it comes to a group of varieties like Australian Aboriginal English. So we're using corpus data, which was collected over the last few years. So I'm not collecting new data at the present. The ethics journey we've been on has been has surrounded a lot of questions. So the ethics board were quite rightly looking for community support for this research into Aboriginal English, but there was perhaps an idea that there needs to be an authoritative body that represents Aboriginal English, and there really isn't one exactly in Australia. It's not really the kind of thing language centres do exactly. So it was quite a challenge to get the idea across that although we can get community support from individuals and some organisations, there's no Australian Aboriginal English Academy that we can apply to. So eventually we did manage to get our point across, and it was good for me as a PhD student in my first year to look at all of the implications of research and navigating the ethical framework of some of the protocols involved. Yeah, so on to some of the preliminary results. In this preliminary phase of the research, we found, it took over a year to get the ethical approval, just for framework there of why we're bringing it up. In this preliminary phase of the research, we did find some patterns, however, in many cases, no observably significant difference is used between any two demographics. Overall, Aboriginal participants produced fewer tokens of uptalk than non-Aboriginal participants. Overall, male participants produced fewer tokens of uptalk than female participants, and overall, little evidence for any really significant intergenerational differences. Some difference in communicative intent was found, with answers and agreement featuring more in correlation with Aboriginal participants' use of uptalk, and quoting speech and indicating personal understanding being more frequent with non-Aboriginal participants. So here's a little chart, perhaps a little bewildering, but each column here represents all declarative utterances extracted for each participant, with blue indicating uptalk tokens, orange indicating rises in the frequency which don't qualify as the 40% benchmark, and grey indicating all of the remaining utterances which are likely a fall in fundamental frequency or pitch. The most significant pattern indicates that non-Aboriginal speakers tended to produce slightly more high-rising terminals as well as more rises overall. When we factor for age, we don't see any really significant demographic producing a much greater frequency of high-rising terminals. In the case of the eldest male Aboriginal participant, we didn't really find any tokens of HRT at this stage in the analysis at least. And looking at gender, male participants produce slightly less than females overall, and this mirrors global trends and observations made elsewhere in which uptalk was initially led by female speakers in earlier periods and has been adopted increasingly by males to a point of somewhat relative equilibrium. On a ranked scale from least to most high-rising terminals as a percentage of total declarative utterances, we notice 3 of the Aboriginal participants grouped at the lower end of usage regardless of age or gender, and 2 non-Aboriginal participants in the most frequent end of the scale, and both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal participants sharing the centre. Plotting each participant in terms of percentages of rises which involve HRT and looking at all 3 social predictors, we see again that female participants are largely using a higher proportion of high-rising terminals than male participants, and that Aboriginal participants are generally producing less than non-Aboriginal participants. So looking at the 2 cohorts, we can see the differences in correlations between specific dialogue acts and the HRT. Non-Aboriginal participants appear to both use the understanding and other categories with greater frequency, with the other category largely made up of direct questions. And non-Aboriginal participants also appear to produce more tokens correlating to the other forward function category, which includes pleasantries and exclamations, with the Aboriginal participants producing none of these utterances. On the other hand, Aboriginal participants appear to be using significantly more backward communicative functions, such as agreement and with high-rising terminals, and employ uptalk significantly more when answering questions than non-Aboriginal participants who rarely seem to. In terms of age, we see some patterns emerging between the two cohorts. Among the Aboriginal participants, we see a decrease over time in HRT correlating with answers and quoted speech, and an increase over time in correlation with understanding. The non-Aboriginal participants also suggest an increase over time in uptalk correlating with understanding, but in contrast to the Aboriginal participants, an increase in correlation with quoted speech, and a decrease over time in backward communicative functions, such as agreement. When factoring for gender, we see that the Aboriginal male participants use high-rising terminals overwhelmingly for straightforward statements, and for agreement approximately a quarter of the time as well, far greater than any other group. The remaining three cohorts demonstrate varying degrees of correlations, with answers making up almost 20% of utterances with uptalk for the Aboriginal female group, whereas the other cohorts only demonstrate this correlation sparingly. So in summary, we still have to further refine our analysis, of course, but we can see some mirroring of previously observed general trends, such as female use being a little more frequently than male, and non-Aboriginal speakers producing more tokens than Aboriginal speakers. But the most fruitful area of analysis at the moment has been the link between high-rising terminals and dialogue acts, with some differences and patterns emerging saliently around the employment of uptalk as a device indicating understanding and answering of questions. So what next? There's still a lot to do. Still quite early in the PhD overall, but we've come a long way. So a larger data set is something which we're working on at the moment. Inter-rater reliability is something which we'll be looking into in more detail, as is significance testing. And more detailed and fine-grained formal analysis. We haven't spoken much today about the form that HER takes in these analyses, but we'll be looking a little bit closer at things like the speed of the rise and also the excursions themselves, what shape and amount rises may take. And one area which was brought up in feedback during the N-Wave conference was the applicability of switchboard damsel as a system which was developed in the 1990s to look at American corpora of American English. And some people in different parts of the world have created new entries which may be more salient. So it's something we've discussed, that perhaps within the yarning context in Australia, there may be some specific communicative forms which aren't covered here, which we can add, and we can create the yarning switchboard damsel. So that's something which will be quite exciting to look into in more detail. So I'd like to wrap up by acknowledging the people of Noongar Boodja for sharing their yarns, and give a special thanks to Adele Gregory at the University of Melbourne and the UWA Centre for Applied Statistics, in particular Marty Firth, for the invaluable technical help, because there's been a lot of technical stuff that I could not have done on my own at all. And I'd like to thank you all for coming along today and tuning in from home. And I think we can open the table up to any questions or comments.
Thank you, Troy. Before we start the question, there's a couple of things. First, I forgot to say that just because it's at 3 p.m., there is an award ceremony during which the linguistics discipline is receiving an award for, what was it, inspiring mentoring of students or something like that. Anyway, we're great. So, yes, and it's over there at the club if you just want to come and have a break, you know, just, it's nothing very, well, it's special, but it's nothing grand, but it's going to be fun. So sorry, that was just sort of housekeeping and that I forgot to
No,
let us
that's
out.
good.
So now you have already stopped sharing your screen. We are going to turn the computer around, or we need to stop recording.
Stop recording?
Yeah.